So my name is Billy Templeton, and I live in Bethany, PA, which is in Wayne County, right outside of Honesdale. I live on around 2 acres, of which I'm probably farming or gardening around an acre. And my operation, and I live with my wife Amanda and our daughter Naomi, is kind of based around a permaculture method where we use chickens as the center of our farm or our homestead, and from there we use the manure for compost in our gardens, and we grow in raised beds. We grow in 3 garden plots, and then we do flowers and edible or perennials that we do in our garden plots as well. So everything that we grow, we try to have a diversified little garden plot. So I just want to talk a little bit about why I got started with gardening and farming. While I was in grad school, I was studying poetry, and I realized at that time that I gravitated towards writers who focused on the natural world. And I had this real romantic notion about farming. At the same time that I was reading and writing this kind of poetry, I realized that a long-standing health problem that I'd been dealing with could be resolved by my diet. I had severe lactose intolerance and irritable bowel syndrome. I had been in and out of doctor's offices for years and never had a solution. My diet was reduced to very bland foods, and that I thought that was just going to be my diet for the rest of my life. That was about the time I started reading Weston Price. If you're not familiar with Weston Price, I would highly recommend checking out that organization and that doctor. And at that time, I started changing my diet slightly to a more grass-based diet, and I say that in terms of vegetables that I was eating, but also in terms of the meat that I was eating and the dairy that I was consuming. So everything, all my dairy products were raw at the time, and all of my meat was grass-based. And after I made that transition, all of my health problems went away. I have no more. I can eat anything that I really want to eat now. Dairy is not an issue. Spicy foods are not an issue. Nothing. So I'm one of those kind of proponents that your diet can really fix a lot of your health problems. And that kind of started me on this track that I'm on today, which is still very much that romantic ideal of farming and the very real get your hands dirty every day. So that's pretty much my life. And I want to introduce my mother-in-law, Sue Klickus. She's a master gardener, and she has a lot of experience with seed starting and growing food as well. She's going to be joining me today and kind of talking about some nuts and bolts things.
Okay, hi, welcome. My name's Susan, and I live about half a mile east of Bill and Amanda in
Half an hour.
Half an hour east of them, near the Delaware River, Beach Lake, Pennsylvania, Narrowsburg, New York area. We have about an 18-acre farmstead, and we got into growing things. I've had gardens all my life, but basically they were, your backyard gardening. I didn't preserve a whole lot and so forth, but as Bill and Amanda moved back into the area after they graduated with their undergrad and so forth, really got talking to us more about the quality of our food and things like that, and sort of the light bulb went off in our heads also to really have control over our food, know where most of our food comes from. And so we really enlarged our gardens, probably 3 times as much gardening as we do. I have brambles, I have raspberries and blueberries and perennial things such as rhubarb and asparagus. And we also do what Bill and Man do. We have chickens, we have layers, we raise our own meat birds, we raise ducks, turkeys, we have pigs that we raise. So we're really trying to take as much control over our food as we can, knowing exactly what the feed we feed them and so forth. And then again, using the manure and this is a cycle of everything on our farm. I'm actually a Marywood alumni also, so I thought I'd throw that in there. We use as many organic practices as we can on our farm. We just recently became certified naturally grown, which is a process as you would go through to be organically certified. It's same premise, but it's a lot less paperwork and a lot less money to become certified naturally grown, and we're Pennsylvania preferred also. So I guess I'm a retired school teacher in the Honesdale School District. I taught for 30 years there, retired 5 years ago. So now I have a lot more time for gardening and raising animals.
And Sue was just on TV the other day. Maybe you recognized her. They do maple syrup. They have a really big operation, and the Newswatch 16 came out and did a little segment on their operation, which was really cool.
Oh yeah, claim to fame.
Okay, so before we get talking nuts and bolts, what you want to put in your garden and how you're going to grow, I thought it essential to discuss what I think and what I think most people who grow food think is the most important thing about your garden, and that's your dirt. That's the soil that you're growing in. I learned early on that soil is not soil, dirt is not dirt. One of the things that we've done with our farming organization is we've started a bunch of community gardens in the Honesdale area, at the local high school, at a retirement home, and at the elementary school as well. And when we were going through that process, we were looking at buying topsoil from a bunch of different topsoil sellers from all over the county. And what we did is we had the soil tested from each location, and we were absolutely amazed at the difference between topsoils. Some topsoil was being sold with absolutely no nutrient value whatsoever. It was essentially sand. It was not topsoil. And if we didn't look into it, we probably would have went with that seller because their reputation was the best, but it certainly was not the best. None of the topsoil that we found was ideal, but we did find one seller who sold something that we were able to amend with compost and nutrients, that we were able to get it up to a passable soil that hopefully we could build on in the future, which is our plan. So that's the first thing I always recommend gardeners to do, is to have your soil tested. And it's a fairly simple process. You could have it, you would dig plugs, and then if you did it properly, you would send your plugs away to a lab and have a reading come back within a couple of weeks. You'd be able to know exactly what you need to put in your soil so that your food is going to be as nutrient dense and flavorful as possible. And really that's, I think, the most essential thing about gardening, is that our food is nutrient dense. A beet is not a beet, a pepper is not a pepper. And that's more so than just this thinking that there's organic and non-organic. Even within the organic food, there's a radical difference, even farm to farm. That's why it's so important to know what you're putting in your soil and what your farmer's putting into his soil as well. So first and foremost, that's something I recommend. There are places that you can buy amendments, and I'm not talking about just Miracle-Gro stuff, but the real NPK stuff, the bone meal, the blood meal, all this different kind of natural products that you can put in your soil to help.
With the soil test, very easy to do, very inexpensive. If you have an extension office here in this county, I know, in Honesdale we have the Wayne County Extension Office through Penn State, and it's $10. You go there, they'll give you get the kit, give you a little bag. It's very instructions, just 1, 2, 3, 4 of how to take a little sample here, a little sample here. You mix the samples together, let it dry. Only send a small little vial in. It'll take maybe 1 to 2 weeks to get your results back, and they'll give you a printout of what they would recommend to add to your soil. Because I think, as Bill said, one of the most common misconceptions is just go to the local farmer and get manure,
Yeah.
and throw it on. But you might end up with a ton of weeds. It
Yeah.
might be too fresh a manure that would all of a sudden you'll end up just with pepper plants that are 4 foot tall, like Jack and the Beanstalks, that don't produce any fruit. So there's too much nitrogen in there and so forth. So the soil is the basis. It's also, your soil is going to hold your water. If you have sandy soil and you can be watering and all of a sudden you water in the morning and your plants are all wilted in the afternoon, it's just not holding the moisture at all.
Yeah.
So soil is the basis of all this. So if you do anything this spring, and don't work the soil too early. That's what I was going to say too.
Yeah.
We're all anxious to get out there, and we've had such a late spring. Let it thaw on its own before you get in there and start working it. But then go with the test. I think it'd be interesting to do, because you really don't know where your soil came from and things like that.
Yeah, yeah, and I have some photos that we can look at later where you'll see that mistake where we used fresh horse manure that wasn't fully composted and grew these beautiful broccoli plants and not a single head of broccoli all year, but they looked nice. And just
lush.
Yeah, oh, totally green, beautiful, no food whatsoever. But one of the quick tests that you could do on a relatively dry day is grab a handful of your soil, squeeze it, and let it go. It should crumble a little bit. If it stays solid like a lump,
Clay.
that's too much clay in your soil. So you'll want to start amending that with a high grade compost or topsoil. And I could talk about compost a little bit later. But I wanted to kind of move into planning your garden bed because that's what's really so exciting at this time of the year. And before we start talking kind of nuts and bolts how we're going to plan a bed, I want to say the most important thing when you're growing, and I'm sure you all know this, but it's important to remind you, grow what you like. There are so many vegetables out there, and I think sometimes when we're looking through the seed catalogs or we go to the store and we look at transplants, we get overwhelmed with choices and we end up planning half of a bed of stuff we're trying or experimenting with and we'll never eat. Grow what you like. And plan from there. I think that's the most important thing. So anything that we say about what plants that you can do in a bed, take with a grain of salt. You certainly want to modify it to fit your diet and what you like.
And if there's anything you want to preserve, that's a thing too.
Sure, yeah.
My garden is probably a third tomatoes because I preserve so many tomatoes and beets, so.
Yeah, okay, so do you want to maybe draw a little bed and we can kind of talk about what the bed looks like?
But I think planning, I do designs all the time in my garden. This is just one of my gardens, and this garden is composed of raised beds that are actually with walls around them, with wood walls, and also raised beds that might be the size of 4 foot wide, the size of this table, that are just in the ground raised beds where it's no till. We till it by our, and you don't walk in it also. So should I pass this around? It's
Sure.
just an idea of every year I do this, and then I rotate things around and so forth. But it's really good to have it on paper, a plan. So when you go out with your seed package, you actually know kind of what you're doing. It's a little faded, but.
So when you're planning your garden, one of the first things that you have to be aware of is the direction of the sun, and know kind of how to arrange your plants in terms of height. So the very first thing is to determine, and we'll just kind of throw a direction up there and assume that the sun's going.
Okay, we're going to say this is south.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. And then another really important aspect of kind of planning your garden is going to be having a water source. And Julie told me that the garden here does have fairly decent water source, although there are a few beds that are a little far away from the spigot and, rain barrels are being discussed. I mean, that's something that I have a little bit of background in. I don't have any rain barrels at the house now, but we could talk about that at the end if there are any questions about it. But make sure that you have a consistent water source. Look into drip tape or soaker hose if you're not able to get out there during the dry spells. That will make a world of difference. Okay, so when we're designing our garden, the first thing to do is to think about the tallest plants that you want to have in your garden, and make sure that they're going to be.
We'll locate the sun first. Where's
Yeah. Right.
Okay.
So we're gonna assume that the first plants we want to go with are going to be tomato plants, right?
Tall plants.
Yeah. So we're going to have our tall plants in the back so that they do not shade. And tomatoes, a lot like peppers, are obviously it takes a long season to produce tomatoes. So that's something that we have to think about from the get-go. Other kind of crops that we're going to put in this bed, if we're looking to maximize production, and I guess that's going to be my perspective, is I'm always looking to maximize production in a raised bed. How can I produce the most food? And to do that, I want to think about plants that can be essentially ripped out of the ground as soon as they're done producing, so that I could have something new in its place, and that's called succession planting. So when I plan a raised bed, and if I'm thinking about only having one raised bed, I want to think about what's essential in terms of long-term plants, my tomatoes and peppers, which I love, my eggplants, And then beyond that, I want to think about what I can get in the ground as soon as possible and when I can get it out of the ground as soon as possible. So plants that are going to go in the ground early April, spinach, lettuce mixes, peas. Peas are very important. So peas are going to be a tall plant that we're going to want in there right away. And they're going to grow up a vine. So we're going to have to trellis our peas and make sure that they're not going to block out the sun so that our spinach is growing in complete shade, which wouldn't be the end of the world.
So you could have a small section
Yeah.
of the peas going up the trellis.
Right. So then, certainly want to be thinking about your garden in terms of biomimicry, I like to say. So we look at nature and we try to understand how plants grow in nature. You're going to have your tall plants on the outside, your kind of medium growth plants next to it, and then your ground cover afterwards. So that's what I'm always thinking about when I'm planting my garden, no matter what specific plants I'm looking at. But so at this point in the season, right now, I'm planning for all of my cool kind of spring crops.
There's actually a handout that we have, that all of you have, with the cool season vegetables that you could start. They're your ones you're going to get in the ground earliest.
Yeah. Now, personally, I'm careful when I do that because I don't want to take away too much space for something like my tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, my nightshades, because they're very important to me and I want to have them in as soon as I'm sure that last frost is gone. So I want to have a space for them. So I'll usually leave a little bit of space for my important plants. Okay, so we have our peas, tomatoes.
What do you want? You want to put some spinaches and
Sure.
carrots and
So
stuff
so
in there?
now we're thinking quick plants, spinach, our lettuce mixes.
You're doing blocks, or how do you
Yep.
do it?
Yeah.
Okay, so we can have. I feel like I'm back teaching. Nothing's working.
And when you're planting this garden, I highly recommend looking into square foot gardening and having a grid. If you have one that you could put right over top of your bed, that works extremely well. I think the book that's up there really details how to do that. So, yeah, so that you can plant in blocks. Another ground cover that I'm thinking about right away are my beets and my carrots, things like that, which can tolerate these frosts. I get them in the ground right away. So I tend to do bigger plots of, yeah.
In midstream, so when you say plant beets and carrots right away, when is right away? Is that now?
As soon as you can work the soil.
Okay, so that's like after the first frost? Or last frost?
No, before, because they can handle the frost. So it tends to be in early April that you'll get this in. Although I've planted peas, I was really ambitious one year and planted peas when I knew we had snow on the way. And they survived the snow, but they didn't grow as vigorously as they should have. So you want to be able to work the soil. You want to be able to kind of make sure that it's breaking up properly, that it's not clumpy and wet. And then you can start kind of planting. Direct seeding, you direct seed those plants, or your carrots and peas, your spinaches, all that stuff, as soon as you can, really. Yeah, and then something else we're going to talk about in order to extend that season a little bit is your row cover. Remay is something you could put over top of your plants, or if you have a hoop house, or just a really quick little makeshift hoop, you can do that as well, and really extend your season. So you're almost gardening, for 10 months out of the year, in a community garden, in a little raised bed garden. So it's really
I've
interesting.
experimented one time with putting lettuce. I just did a little block of lettuce, a couple blocks in the fall, and it didn't do anything in the fall. But lo and behold, in the spring, there it was, and it just did its. When it was ready, and it started growing, and I had lettuce way before I ever did before. So you could put your spinach, your lettuce, your carrots. These are low growing also. Mm-hmm. But there's different ways of doing it. Like you say, you could do blocks with the square, with the grid.
You do rows.
I do shorter rows. Like if this is 4 foot, I do rows coming like this. In maybe a block. So
Yeah.
it's all an experiment. It's kind of fun with this because every year you can try it a little bit differently, see what works and see what doesn't, and move things around a little bit.
As you can see in the slides over here, this was our first year growing in a raised bed, And we spent a lot of time thinking about the relationship between plants, the companion planting. We spent a lot of time, you could see spinach in the front. We were doing corn. We wanted to throw the book at our garden beds. We did everything we could in these beds, and it was a mistake everywhere we went. This was a nightmare, to be honest with you. It looks really nice when everything's just germinating and popping through. After a month and a half or two, it was a jungle. And this was the year, I don't know if any of you were gardening, where the blight ripped through and destroyed our tomato plants, destroyed our peppers. And, we really put ourselves in a situation where even if the blight wasn't coming through that year, it would have destroyed us because there was no room. So that's one of my big pieces of advice is make sure you do not overcrowd. Even if you're square foot gardening and you're thinking about doing a plot of greens, right? You're talking mesclun mix or some kind of gourmet lettuce mix. It's a mistake, I think, to just cover that whole area with seed. First of all, you're wasting seed, wasting money, but you're also not allowing the plant itself to take root and to really kind of blossom into the lettuce leaf that it wants to become. So be careful about that. Read your seed packet and know how to plan, and make sure you do not overcrowd. Interplanting is, that's
what I
way
would say.
way too tight.
The corn.
Corn in general is something that I'm very down on. I grow corn for my chickens now, but I do not grow it in raised beds, and it's really just for fun. Growing corn on a small scale is not a smart thing to do. Interplanting, however, is, and this is something I still do all of the time. And you can find books on this topic that really go in depth. One is called Carrots Love Tomatoes, I believe. And that's a really interesting way of thinking about planting your beds so that your tomatoes, when they start, are going to be very small. They're going to take off when it gets warm. You get those warm nights, so they'll really grow. But until then, you can certainly grow your carrots in between your tomatoes and have your carrots fully grown and harvested before your tomatoes shade them out. And it's a really fantastic way to garden. And you can do this with almost anything. This year I have a slide coming up that's I'm growing beets and eggplant together. Another really excellent combo. So you have your longer season plants that are going to go the full season, and then you could think about all of the space in between while it's still young for whatever you want. Obviously, and we have a handout as well that kind of talks about what does well together, what has a symbiotic relationship. It's a fairly complicated kind of science. I'm just interested
Companion planning.
I'm just interested in maximizing production always.
Yeah. But you think of the turnover of a radish, how quickly they grow. And so if you had your really slow growing peppers, you can have your radishes in and out of here, circle them, put them in between before peppers are slow growing. So use that space, use the space in between to maximize production. It's also going to cut down on weeds because you have something there that's growing that you want to grow.
Right.
Also.
Now, in terms of space consideration, again, corn is problematic. Another one that's extremely problematic that I'm not a fan of is squash. And I'm talking about the entire family of squash in your raised bed. I know that really kind of breaks a lot of gardeners' hearts because everyone likes to think about their yellow zucchini or their yellow kind of squash. It's such a waste of space, I think. And I see this mistake all of the time where folks will take up half of their garden and they'll plant 4 little squash plants, and then by June, half of their garden is completely gone and they're overrun with squash that they'll never eat. I never understood that. Like, if you like squash, maybe one little squash plant in the corner, stick it somewhere. But I'm not a big fan of squash. I'm really not. I like to eat it, but I've found that if I don't plant any squash at all, I know somebody who's planted a few and are giving me tons of squash anyway. So I avoid squash.
And even if you do the bush type, they're still going to be this big around.
Yeah,
and they're
absolutely.
Going to take over. One plant will take over the whole end of your raised bed. So it's better, maybe even try that at home in a 5-gallon pail or something. A squash would do well in that. Cucumbers are the same thing.
Yeah, cucumbers are the same. Again, it's one of those things where
I love cucumbers.
Yeah, gardening is for a lot of folks is that ripe tomato and that cool cucumber. That's gardening. And that's great. If that's what you're into, go for it. But if you're really interested in increasing your production and really getting as much food as possible, it's not going to be your best bet. It's just they're heavy feeders. They take up tons of space. It's just not worth it.
I think you just have to really look at the varieties of things you're growing also.
Right.
That's one thing we're going to talk about here too.
So in terms of things I do like in a raised bed, beans. I love beans. Sue and I were talking about this last night. She's a big fan of the pole bean. And the pole bean is fantastic, I think, as long as you can trellis it. And that's something that we're doing in that second picture there. We're essentially doing a three sister setup there with not nearly as much space.
That didn't work too though.
No, I mean, again, like in theory, it was a great idea, but you could trellis your pole beans, but your bush beans are going to produce so much food. They grow so fast. You can get them out of there and then have another plant in for the heat of the hot part of the summer. When you're growing these kind of plants, another very important thing to consider is harvesting. That you're picking the fruit as often as possible. If you're looking to maximize production on any plant, the more you pick it, the more it'll produce, which is really an awesome kind of relationship to have with these plants. So, I think in terms of yourself as a gardener, you have to consider how much time you're going to put in. But if you're looking to spend a lot of time, these are the plants that will produce a lot of food as long as you're on top of everything.
Yeah, I think it's just you really need to look at the seed packets, and look at your catalogs. They give really good descriptions of the size, of the plant. Is it going to be trellising? Is it climbing? Is it a bush type? If you're like Bill said, if you just love that fresh cucumber, fresh tomato, and that's what you're looking for, well, don't nix that because we said it's hard to grow in a raised bed. It will grow wonderful in a raised bed. It's just going to take up space for other things. But there are varieties of cucumbers that lead themselves better to a raised bed,
Yeah.
and so forth. I mean, there's climbing. You could do the same thing in back where you took your peas down. You could put the vining cucumbers back here, like the Asian burpless that go up and over. Maybe your bed is near a fence in the back or something. Utilize that fence to grow things going up that will go up and trellis and so forth. And with the green beans, you can plant them in succession also.
Mm-hmm.
Leave a week in between your plantings, and then as this one, you harvest this one, rip it out, sow something else in there, and just always, you really don't want any empty space in here.
No, definitely not. And a couple of other plants that I think are essential in any garden are kale and collards. I absolutely essential. They will produce for you all year long if you stay on top of kale and collards. Just harvest as you go, and you can certainly eat them in the summer, but if you wait until after that frost in the fall, that's I think one of the finest crops out there is kale after a frost.
Since you mentioned kale, before I forget, I've noticed that when I purchase kale, let's say, in one of the plastic containers in Wegmans, it's so fine, it's so delicate, it's lovely, but it spoils so quickly. Yet I bought, just on a lark, a box of kale at Caribbean Park Summit, and it was grown in East Benton in a sustainable vertical farming environment. And that kale lasted a long time. Why does one kale last a long time and another kale, man, I better eat it in 4 days or I throw it out again?
So the question is, how do you make sure that your vegetable produce is going to stay fresh? Or how do you, or why is it that some vegetables don't stay as fresh as long as others? Okay.
Well, I was going to say, kale is picked at different times in its life cycle. So if you have a baby kale, a younger kale leaf that's picked, like you say, maybe it was more delicate or something, and it is going to be more delicate as it gets more mature. It's more mature, it's more hardy, even in the garden. Pests aren't going to eat it as much, and it's going to last longer in your refrigerator also.
And
that's what I was thinking.
Sure, and that's certainly, without a doubt, an issue. It's a very, I think, complicated question that I plan on kind of trying to touch on later, which is how do we harvest to maximize the length of food, to keep it fresh as long as possible. I think one of the problems you may be experiencing is that when you buy food at the supermarket, you're not entirely sure where it's coming from. On average, your produce is traveling 1,500 miles to reach to your supermarket. How are they preserving that for that journey is a big question. Usually, it's not going to stay as fresh when it travels that long. That said, you can deal with tomatoes that are picked completely green and ripen on the truck with a spray or something along those lines. I mean, there are ways that they can kind of get around that. If you're looking to buy direct from a farmer, obviously it's coming from the field after, hopefully a day or two. Now, within that, I mean, that's tricky because I've bought in food and grown food myself that has lasted a week and sometimes lasted 2 days. And I think the main reason for that is when and how it was harvested. If your produce is being harvested in the middle of the day, if you go out to your garden and harvest your kale at 1 o'clock in the afternoon when the sun's out, it's going to wilt within hours. However, if you go out at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning when the sun's just coming up really and it's still cool, there's still dew, and you use a sharp knife and you get a clean cut on your kale, you get it in cold water and then in the fridge, that kale will last weeks. I mean, this kale's starting to go and get a little wimpy, but if that was harvested fresh and preserved in cold water right in your fridge, kale should not go wimpy within a week.
Alrighty. I think we need to move off the planting the garden, don't you think, Bill? Mm-hmm. Okay. I was just going to recap sort of. I think the best thing is, most important, see where your sun is, see where it's traveling, tall things in the back, stepping it down to your short things.
One thing we didn't touch on that is extremely important, and I hope and assume a lot of you know this, but when you're picking tomato plants in particular, know the difference between determinate and indeterminate plants. Because if you just love a variety that you find and decide to go with the indeterminate, you could find that tomato plant will grow 10 to 15 feet in the summer and completely take over your garden. The determinate plant is meant to stay small and is probably better for raised bed, although that's a little tricky because they tend to be hybrids, and if you're looking to save seed, that could be tricky.
But yeah, what the determinate means, it's going to stay, it's going to grow up, set its fruit, and then have the fruit will mature and it will stop growing.
Right.
The indeterminate keeps on going. You'll still have blossoms right before it's freezing of new tomatoes coming on. They're the ones that don't do well in cages. You put them in a cage when they're little and all of a sudden the cage is tipping over. Mm-hmm. So any of your seed catalogs, it'll say determinate or indeterminate. So for the raised beds, I would highly recommend determinate tomatoes. And when you're doing that, with the determinate, don't go pruning them. A lot of people would take off all the suckers. Just don't do that. Don't do that. And whenever you see blossoms, some people still take off some of the suckers, they call it, the branches underneath where it's fruiting, but don't ever clip the tops because you're clipping off all your fruit up there. Okay.
So just one last thing, talking about your garden again, I think it really helps to think about your garden bed as 3 separate gardens. You have your spring cool season crops. You want to get them in, harvest, and get them out. Your summer crops, and you have a handout that should tell you exactly what summer crops go in. Then you could get your summer crops in there. There are still lettuces that if you harvest properly, you can grow throughout the summer. Mesclun mix is great for that if you harvest it small.
Put them in the shade of your other taller things.
Mm-hmm. And then there are certain lettuce heads that you can do as well in the summer. And then kind of late August, rip all of that stuff out when it's pretty much done producing, and then get your fall garden in.
Which is basically your cool season things again.
Most of your cool season stuff again. Yeah.
It's going to be a shorter term to maturity.
Yeah, less light.
Yeah.
Okay, so you want to talk a little bit about transplants and
Sure.
direct seeding?
Yeah. Amanda said that some people were toying with the idea of actually starting their own transplants and so forth. I do that. I have a small greenhouse and so forth, and it's really, really rewarding. And it's really fun because you aren't limited to what you find at the Home Depot or your garden center. If you are looking to purchase unusual vegetables, and heirloom tomatoes, the only option might be to go into a farmer's market, and they might be available there. But if you want to, go to, 2 seed catalogs that we both use a lot are Young and Johnny's. and if you just Google them, you can order right online also. But you'll have a lot better variety. So that's maybe why a lot of people like to start their own. Plus, it's really rewarding to say I grew that from seed, instead of just the transplant. I do have a handout on starting seeds indoors, and I just want to, since we're kind of running out of time and so forth, what I do is I was thinking about the easiest things that I like to start is basically your tomatoes, because certain things you cannot, yes, you can have a tomato grow from seed, but it's going to take you so long to have that happen. So you want to get a jump start on that. I usually start my tomatoes mid-April. One of the common mistakes is people start them too early. And what happens is by the time we're ready to put those in, I would never suggest, maybe over here you could, I don't plant anything until after Labor Day, or Memorial Day, after Memorial Day. That's just my rule of thumb. Now, last year where we live, we had frost Memorial Day weekend, and we were covering everything. So it was pretty tricky.
Although I gambled and won last year. I went in 2.5 weeks before Memorial Day, and with row cover I missed it, and my tomatoes were ready 2 weeks before everyone. Yeah. So if you're a gambling person, go for it.
Two of my favorite things to grow in the garden are broccoli and Brussels sprouts. So I do, and to me that would be worth putting 3 or 4 Brussels sprout plants in there, because the yield of those is awesome, and they grow right up to frost. You can leave them, have snow on them and so forth, and come over and harvest them. It's just wonderful plants. And there's a certain type of broccoli that I found that, it just kept reheading. You take the main head off, but it just kept shoving up shoots. So again, look at the descriptions. It's very important to look at the description of the plant you're buying. Just don't look at the pretty picture on the front and say, oh, that looks delicious, and so forth. So tomatoes, relatively easy. Broccoli, cabbage, the brassicas are very easy to start. So know your varieties. You can get a about better choice and so forth. As far as soil to use, when I first started, you can go into the Agway or something, or Home Depot, and they give soil starting mix. A seed starting mix. I used it the first year. I was very disappointed. It's basically a lot of peat moss, a lot of vermiculite, extremely hard to keep the plants watered. I just use a potting soil. You don't want to go to your raised bed and scoop out a little dirt and so forth and start with that. You have a lot of weed seed in that. So what you buy it in a bag, it's sterilized. I use a regular potting soil. It holds the moisture a lot better. So if I'm going to start, I use a lot of recycled things for starting. This was just like a takeout container and so forth. You have to make sure you have good drainage on the bottom. And I like the ones that actually have a lid that come with them, so it's very easy. If you don't have a lid, put some, you have to cover it. We'll get that in a second. Anyhow, so the soil, I always wet my soil. I have a tub, and I wet the soil. You don't want it so when you squeeze it, the water's just running out, but just so when you squeeze the soil, it stays together a little bit, and if you really squeeze, you might be able to get a drop of soil out.
Oatmeal.
So you have it wet. It's sort of crumbly like oatmeal, like Bill said. So you fill your container, tamp it down a little bit, and you don't want it right to the tippy top, maybe down about a ½ inch and so forth. Read the seed packet. On your seed packet, it'll say the depth that you should plant them. Some like to be in the ground. Some actually basically like to lay on the top of the soil, and you just sort of press them down in with your finger a little bit. So read. The soil's already moistened, and then you will cover it. Okay? And seeds like to be warm. They sell seed heating mats. In my greenhouse, I don't have to do that. The first year I had my husband build a whole big sand tray. We had wire in it, to keep it at a certain temperature. But I basically fried my seeds because in the greenhouse there was so much solar gain anyhow that I nixed that idea.
But if you're growing on your windowsill, those seed mats are fantastic.
Yeah.
They're really good.
And you can get those at any of the growing stores. And if you just want to start a few things for your bed, they're pretty neat. They're maybe like a 2x2 mat or 2x1 mat or something like that. Work really nice, and you be careful though with that. And the most important thing is to keep them wet. Now, when I do my plants watering's the most crucial thing, soil and watering. And if you overwater, you're going to have a lot of problem. They're going to come up nice, and all of a sudden they're just going to fall right over. It's called dampening off. They'll sort of rot right off at the top of the soil. So you don't want that either. Whenever I water, I do not water from the top. I would have another tray, and I would put water in that tray, a cooking tray or something like that, a baking tray, and set that in there. Let it sit for 15 minutes, a half an hour, until it soaks up the water from the bottom, and then make sure you have it on something back in your windowsill where it has good drainage also. Sit it on rocks or pebbles or just up some way that it's not sitting in water after you let it sit in water. Do you know what I mean? So it has good drainage. These, if you're looking to buy something that works really well, I found these years ago, and I start most of my tomatoes in these. They're just I have quite a few of these, and I usually put about 3 seeds in each cell, after you wet your soil and so forth. And it's good to tamp it down because I don't know, you don't want to compact it down and really tight, but just tamp it down a little bit. But you put your seeds in there. It works out really nice because these have the watering tray right in there, and actually it raises up. So you can put some water in there. Well, by the time it soaks it up, I don't know if you see there's like little pegs on it, so it actually holds it up. And then when it soaks up the water, it's actually out of the water, so it's going to have drainage. Has its own little cover that comes with it. I have had these for 15, 20 years. You just keep track of them. Now you can see that I haven't cleaned them yet. If you're reusing something, make sure you sterilize it. And sterilizing it, just water with just a little tiny bit of Clorox in it. Just a little bit of Clorox and make sure they're sterile. So as soon as you see the seedling come up, poking through, uncover it. You don't want to leave the cover on. It's going to have too much moisture, and you're going to have a lot of problems that way also. Biggest mistake is, of course, planting too early. And then what happens is you get really long, leggy plants, spindly, and things like that. And once they get like that, there's really not much recovery. A couple of things to avoid having that happen is to make sure you have good light source. And when they're first little tiny plants, if you are using any type of grow light system, you want the light to be very close to the plant. And as the plant's growing higher, of course, move your light source up. If you're using a window, of course, you want to keep spinning them and so forth. But if they're tall and spindly, it's probably because they're needing more light. They're growing towards the light and so forth. Too much water or not enough water. So there are the 3 main problems. The insufficient light and so forth. One thing that will help sturdy up your plants a little bit is we brush the plants. So as they're coming up and they're about 2 inches tall, because it just stiffen them up a little bit to get them more hardy, just take your hand over and you're just gently brushing them a little bit, and that will actually strengthen their root system and so forth. Another thing you could do is actually, if you have a fan, set the fan by your seedlings. If if you have a table of seedlings or something, and have the fan rotating, and then you'll be turning them and so forth. But that'll also strengthen stem and strengthen the root system of the plant. So there's a really good. On the back, it tells you what things are really good to start inside and what things to direct sow. So, and even on the seed packets, it will say that whether they should be started as a transplant or if it's better to sow them in the bed. Yes, direct sow.
How long do you brush it, and how often?
How long do you brush it and how often?
Oh, if it feels really good to you, no. If it's soothing. Now, just, back and forth maybe 2 times, and do it. If they're in your house, it's kind of fun, to go talk to them twice a day or something. Yeah.
You recommend a radio station,
So, but you can see it's just, the little stem is coming up. It's providing some. If it was out in the wind, it would be the same thing. Just to strengthen that root system up. If there's any other question on that, or anybody wants more information on starting seeds, I'd love to talk to you more about that at the end, but we have a lot more to go on. So anything else that you want to say on that?
Well, just that if you are looking for transplants, but you don't want to start them yourself, obviously there are garden centers you can go to, but if you're looking for those unique varieties, Seed Savers, the organization, the magazine, allows you to buy single transplants and they ship them to you. It sounds crazy, but we've purchased some really amazing plants that we just wanted to try 1 or 2 of these tomatoes or peppers, and they shipped them right to our door, and they were healthy as can be. They went right into the garden and did really well. So I recommend checking out the Seed Savers. Just in general, Seed Savers is something that I think is very beneficial to gardeners.
And also, if you're going to go to the local garden center and you're looking at transplants you're going to buy, bigger isn't always better, because sometimes you have the really big sturdy tomatoes and that doesn't mean they're going to be the best thing for you. If you can, pop one of them out of their pot. And if the roots are so tangled and so much root, if you see a whole bunch of root coming out the bottom, it's called root bound, and I would pass on that plant. Go for the smaller ones. You're probably going to be having
Less shock.
Yeah, it is. It's going to shock them once you take it out of there and so forth. And don't get things that are yellowish color. Look for really healthy plants. Shop around. It's very important.
Okay, so there's obviously not much time we're going over, but there are some important things I wanted to talk about that I think are that might be useful to your garden in terms of saving seeds. And it's something that you should talk about as a garden community, because if you're looking to save seeds, you're obviously looking to grow open pollinated or heirloom plants. But the problem with growing open pollinated plants is if you're not in communication with each other, you could very well be cross-pollinating your plant with your neighbor's plant. And then when you go to save seeds, you're not going to get that parent plant. So keep that in mind when you're planting. Obviously, hybrid seeds are, you'll receive amazing plants. They've come long ways and really done amazing things with hybrid plants. But if you're looking to save seeds, that's not the plant that's going to provide you the parent. So you got to be careful with that. You're looking at open pollinated. But if there's something that you as a garden want to center on saving, corn, for example, just say that that's something you're into, because that's what I did last year. You're all going to want to grow the same corn. You can't mix it up because that's so easily to cross-contaminate, and then you'll have an ear of corn with all different kernels on it. Cool looking, but it's not what your goal is. And that can be said for almost all of your major plants. Now, if you look at an organization like Seed Savers, or there are different places that are really interested in preserving some of these really ancient seeds, which is so important, I think, and something that we as gardeners need to think about. There are ways to protect your plants using things like row cover or remay, so that you'll protect it from that cross-pollination, but that's something that you'll really have to research, and maybe if we come back we could talk about a little bit more. But again, it's important that you think about this before you get the seeds in, just in case you have 3 or 4 people putting in different heirloom varieties that are going to cross-contaminate and you won't get the parent. Which, it's not the end of the world if that happens. I have a friend who's growing in South Canaan, and he's really produced this amazing Prudence purple tomato that's now this pinkish tomato, and it's very unique to his farm, and he uses it at the market, and people absolutely love it. It's not a pure Prudence purple, but it's an amazing tomato that is his tomato at this point. He's been saving for 10 years, and it's probably has some other genetics in it at this point, but we're big fans of it. So
It's so amazing.
the flavor of the Prudence purple, it's a beefsteak, so it's a big juicy tomato, and it just has a really tomatoey flavor, if that makes sense, and it's very juicy. It does fairly well against pests, and the plant itself is a fairly healthy plant, which is tricky with some heirloom tomatoes. Sometimes they're more vulnerable. Your hybrids often can protect against blights or molds, things of that nature. So that's something to consider with your hybrid determinate tomato plants, which, I love the variety that tomatoes offer, but if I'm looking again to maximize space, I'm probably going to go with my determinate hybrids. It's just the way it is.
I do in my garden, especially with my tomatoes, because I'm looking for a lot of tomatoes to make sauce with. And but it'll tell you in here, look for determinate. It will tell you whether they're resistant to early blight, late blight, and if that's what you're looking for is production, I would suggest going for that.
Yeah. Some other things, I hear that you have some problems with pests or varmints kind of getting into the garden. That's always tricky. I think having some kind of hardware cloth maybe buried along your fence really helps, so it's under the ground. Woodchucks can't come under. You have to do that before you have the woodchuck problem. Rabbits can get through the fence. They don't really burrow, but they go through the fence. So having like a hardware cloth or chicken wire up the fence 3 or 4 feet really helps as well.
Yeah, because our fence has the squares in it about like this to keep the deer out.
Right.
But then all along the bottom we have the smaller chicken wire.
Right.
So the rabbits can't come in.
So that's varmint wise. We're both. Yeah, go ahead.
How deep would you have to bury the fence?
2 feet.
2 feet.
That's about what we did.
Yeah, even if you were down a foot, it's really gonna still deter them.
Yeah, yeah.
And you when you do that, if this is the outside world, you're the varmints trying to get into the garden, you would put it down and you usually
Curl it.
curve it towards the outside.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
so it doesn't have to be straight down. It's kind of down and
Yeah.
curved
Bends
out
up.
a little bit. Yeah.
This is one of our main tools that we use, and this is remay or row cover that we can place over our plants. This will keep your leaf cutters, your stink bug, all of these bugs that can quickly destroy your flea beetles, your arugula, for example, which is a crime because arugula is so good in the spring. To have those little flea beetles come in and destroy your crop is painful. So this is what we use.
So how do we know that the grower we're buying from at the farmer's market doesn't use toxic chemicals?
You ask,
Oh,
and
they're
if
gonna tell you?
they have to,
should.
and if they don't, then you assume.
Don't buy from them.
Yeah, I mean, if someone were to come to me and ask me that question, I'd be proud. That's something I want to talk about. I want you to come to my place and see how I grow. And that's how your farmer at the farmer's market should feel as well. And if they're not, if they're guarded, you know, that's Joel Saladin's whole thing now is I'm transparent. I want you to come and look at my farm because that way you know what I'm growing. You go to any major corporate farm and see if you can go inspect their facility. They'll never let you within 100 miles of their farm. So that's the question. You know, are you transparent? Can I come to your farm?
Just ask the questions, and like Phil said, if they're beating around the bush,
Yeah,
there's a lot of other people you can go to buy from.
absolutely.
But people lie, don't they? Or
Well,
If you suspect they're lying, go to their farm. We've done it. At our farmers market in Wayne County, we had a grower that we suspected was lying. We went to his farm and inspected. We found out he was lying. He was trucking in produce from Lancaster. He was driving down, and he wasn't growing as much as we were selling. He kicked him out of the farmers market. It happens.
Oh, okay. So
It
there's
happens.
Some sort of, monitoring amongst.
And that's up to your farmers market or your community garden. That's something that you have to kind of figure out amongst yourselves about how you're going to manage something like that, which is tricky. And you know, that's
there's certain things that I use to prevent some problems with things, and one is really easy. With any of my pole beans one time, or even regular beans, one time and everything was just cut right down, like someone went through with a weed whipper. And what it is just a little grub type thing comes out and it just nips them right off by the stems. So what I do is I collect the old toilet paper rolls. It's been starting about a month now. But as you take your transplants, and I should have said also, when I put the tomatoes in those little things with a cover, that's only until it has the first true leaves, which are like the second set of leaves. Then I carefully, with a spoon, so you don't disturb the roots, take them out and pot them up. You know, you always want to pot them up into something bigger like that, the terracotta looking one there. So anyhow, when you're putting that out into the garden, I put my little broccoli plant in the ground and then carefully put this down over, and sometimes they're not hardly, you know, just a little few of the leaves are sticking out, but you put this down into the ground about that much, and it just works like a charm. And throughout the season, this will deteriorate and just go into the ground, but by that time the stem is tough enough that those little stem borers or whatever aren't going to just nip this right off. But I use this for cabbage, broccoli,
Just all the
beans,
brassicas. Yeah,
all the
beans too.
brassicas and so forth. The row cover is great, but you have to make sure if you are doing squash or cucumbers that is going to have a flower, you don't want this on when they're flowering because then they're not going to be pollinated. You're welcome. I'm going to pass this around if everyone wants to see it.
What is that? That's roll cover?
This is called row cover.
or remay. That's another way that they'll catalog it in Johnny's or somewhere else. I believe it's just REMAY. Could be wrong
it's
there.
Always under row cover also.
Yeah.
But it's not very expensive, and you can reuse it. This one we haven't even used yet, but it's very thin, and there's certain different thicknesses of this. So if you're thinking of season extension, you can actually get thicker. We just lay it over the top and just put rocks along the edge. You know, they do sell wire like hoops that will keep it up and so forth. But you know, you can get a bigger roll and just cut the pieces that you need.
Will that protect against frost?
Yes.
Okay.
To a certain extent.
Light frost. They do make
Yeah.
heavier ones that will protect against.
And the rain will go through it, the sun gets through it, so it's a fairly useful crop. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's how organic farmers are able to grow pretty lettuces. Otherwise, they're eaten up. lettuces, which is they're fine. They still taste good. It's just it's not as appealing to the eye.
One thing that I want to say for fungal problems, like molds and mildews and things like that, with my training with Master Gardening is that you do not water before dark, right before dark. You don't want your foliage to be wet and the ground to be wet and so forth. I try to water early in the morning, so the plants have the daytime to dry off and so forth. It's kind of reversed. I know my mother always was out watering all her flowers and so forth at night all the time, so it wasn't going to evaporate and dry up, but the thinking of that has totally changed. We're big fans of mulching also.
Yes.
Very important for pest control, for moisture control. Mulching, I just can't say enough about it. If you're having trouble getting to the garden and watering and so forth, make sure you have a nice layer of mulch. But if you have your little plant like this, you don't want to have it buried in the mulch.
No.
I usually try to keep it where it's coming out of the ground, sort of make it like a reverse volcano. And that's true of any mulching you're doing on your house. This is a pet peeve of any master gardener. If you have a tree in your yard and you put mulch this way, up the tree, that's killing your tree. You want the mulch to be this way. All right, so the stem of your tree, the mulch is almost at the ground level by the base of your trunk, and then having it go up. If you see landscapers doing this where it's halfway up the tree or a foot up the tree, it might look pretty, really bad. Okay.
Particular kind of mulch, like at our garden, Mark will just have a local person that trims trees come and just dump whatever they have in a big pile for us, and that's what we use.
So you're using bark and tree limbs, like you're using wood mulch.
Yeah,
Wood mulch can be problematic because what it can do is actually suck nutrients out of the soil until it breaks it down. If you're using that in your pathways, that's not a bad thing. Although I will say it'll attract slugs. It's a haven for slugs, wood mulch. Ideally, in your garden, you're going to use straw, not hay. Although I use a thick layer of hay and I don't worry about the weeds. But in a raised bed, you're going to want to use straw because it doesn't have the weed seeds. And I think the wood shavings or chips that you're getting, if you can compost them, they're excellent. It might take a little bit longer, but that's a lot of carbon. That's really good. If you can mix in some nitrogen, you could really get that compost pile cooking. And the beautiful thing about using wood chips in your compost is it adds a fungal component to your compost that's really important if you're looking to grow kind of more woody plants. So, your compost you could do a whole day on compost, but yeah.
But the mulch, another thing you can use is grass clippings. A lot of people use grass
That's where your
clippings,
nitrogen comes from.
To put on. And then the straw, I use mulch hay also, which is a poor quality hay, and that's what Bill uses also. Sometimes some straw because you don't have the weed seed. But a lot of people use grass clippings. But you have to be careful if they're your grass clippings, you're not putting a pesticide on them that's going to kill, or a herbicide that you're trying to get rid of the broadleaf dandelions, and you put that on your garden, all of a sudden your plants are dying. So be careful of grass clippings also.
So before we open it up for questions, I just want to put a couple plugs out there. Tomorrow, the Wayne County PASA group that we're both associated with is putting on another lecture like this at the Wayne County Library in Honesdale, and that's on unusual vegetables, being done by Dave Nonamaker of Nonamaker Acres. And he is an expert gardener who specializes in Asian varieties of plants that are absolutely delicious. Things that, to this day, he'll give us vegetables that I've never heard of nor tasted and that continually surprise me. He's a very kind of unusual speaker and fun. So if you're out that way,
Extremely knowledgeable.
very smart guy. And I believe that starts at 11:30 or 11. Oh,
Yeah,
Yeah.
I thought it was 10:30 to tell you the truth. I don't know.
we'll find out
Okay.
that specific time.
10:30.
10:30.
10:30 at the Wayne County
10:30.
Public Library on North Main Street.
This weekend is also the Maple Tour, and Sue will be a part of the Maple Tour.
Yeah, this is a really fun event. If if you didn't get a brochure, I have some up here, or if we don't have enough and people want to go, you can go, there's a website you can go to and download the brochure. But this is the Northeastern Pennsylvania Maple Producers. So it's a multi-county-wide event. It's 2 days, it's all free. There's 10 sugar bushes, is what you call that. On here, there's a map. Maybe if you can go to all 10, you can pick one close to you. The season's just starting. We just probably had 3 or 4 runs where the sap was really flowing. We've been boiling a few times, of course not yesterday or the day before, it was so cold. But today it's going to warm up, and people will be boiling. There'll be product for sale, value-added things like the maple sugar, maple creams, and things like that at different places. There's also 2 pancake breakfasts that are tied into each day and so forth too. So really a fun family activity also. So we're Augusta Acres. That's the name of my farm. So we're the bottom farm down there. If you want to come to see me.
And next Saturday, I'll be giving another lecture at the Wayne County Library, it's part of the Food for Thought series, and that'll be on beekeeping and other pollinators. I keep a few hives, nothing major, but it's something that I feel is extremely important, not so much in terms of honey production, but in terms of just pollination and keeping this kind of diverse ecosystem thriving and healthy, which is obviously tricky thing to do these days. So I'll be kind of talking a little bit about that, maybe an intro to beekeeping, how you can get started, and then move into how you can design your garden to be bee friendly and how you can attract other pollinators to your garden or property.
I wish we would have had this much time on each one of these subjects.
Yeah,
raising, doing transplants, that could have been a whole talk for me. And I feel like I missed so many things I'm thinking now that I didn't share. But, we can open up to question. Even pest control and so forth like that. It's just there's so much information. And I feel like we just spilled a bunch of just little tidbits to you. But
every March, we do a series of lectures at the library. Always dealing with a different aspect of gardening. Sometimes it's a little more geared towards a larger farm, but they're always interesting and they're always full of helpful hints that focus on more specific kind of areas around gardening. Mm-hmm. So on that note, open it up to questions. Anybody have anything that they want to ask about your particular garden, the setup, plants that you might want to grow, things of that nature?
Problems, concerns?
Yeah.
Getting my soil tested. Do you have anything for Lackawanna County? I only live about a mile.
Do they have an extension office? Do you know?
I do, and I've been there. It's downtown. They have a master gardener spot, and they tested my soil. I had some fungus and stuff like that, and they said that Penn State can get tested.
Mm-hmm.
So they may do also a soil test.
Penn State is who you'll send the test to. Yes, and it's the extension office. It's $10, and they'll give you the equipment. It comes with all the directions and so forth. Very easy to do.
And if you're looking to avoid the extension for whatever reason, there's a lab called A&L Labs, where you just pull your soil. They'll send you a container to put your soil in. So you get it in the mail, you pull your soil, dry it out like Sue was explaining, put it in, send it off. You don't even have to leave your house. They'll just do everything in the mail. There are other labs similar to that.
Don't Penn State with the farmers markets open down, all right?
Okay.
So they're pretty good. So
Great.
Penn State is mentioned no problem.
Great. Good.
I'll have something to do.
Yeah.
I'll keep it busy.
Sounds good.
Well, no, it just started some seedlings in the house yesterday.
What seedlings?
Muesli.
I'm sorry?
He's just started lettuce. Muesli.
Oh,
He just started.
okay. Interesting. Onions are pretty much what you're looking to start right now. You could start your onions and be ready to go. Other than that, it's tricky, but peas and things of that nature, if you're really crossing your fingers.
That's why I want the soil checked, because we tried peas one year and they all died.
Huh, that's interesting.
It was
Now,
against the fence, so they could be trellised.
Yeah.
Nothing came up. Very few came up.
Well,
Let's keep up with terrible.
peas are notorious for not germinating properly, and you can buy an inoculant for the seed, and you kind of put the inoculant on the pea itself before you plant it to help germination. Peas are notoriously bad for germinating. That said, it's an excellent plant because it's a nitrogen fixer. So if you're putting that in your garden along with like beans and things of that nature, you're setting your garden up for success for the rest of the season. Anything you follow that with is it should do fairly well because of the nitrogen it's pulling out of the air and putting it in the soil.
Because my raised beds or tomatoes, forget about it. I harvested a couple bushels last year.
Yeah, it was a good year for tomatoes last year.
Yeah, last year tomatoes were great.
Yeah.
I've got a couple gallons of sun-dried tomatoes.
Awesome.
You couldn't believe it. He's like, he kept drying them and drying them.
Yeah, that's great.
Just would not stop growing.
Anything else? Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. No.